Welcome to the 11th episode of the LRB Close Readings podcast On Satire with me, Claire Bucknell.
And with me, Colin Burrow. And we're both fellows of All Souls and we're contributors to the paper.
And today we arrive in the 20th century.
Which is really scary for me, particularly from where we're sitting in my 15th century study. You know, it's a wild, futuristic adventure today.
And our subject is the novel A Handful of Dust by Evelyn Waugh, published in 1934.
Which was less than a century ago. I mean, that's almost yesterday.
Almost yesterday, yeah. Waugh took the title, and in fact the epigraph to the novel, from lines in T.S. Eliot's poem The Wasteland. I will show you something different from either your shadow at morning striding behind you or your shadow at evening rising to meet you. I will show you fear in a handful of dust. So that sets the tone. It's a different kind of satirical novel from anything we've talked about so far, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, we've had Lawrence Sterne's life-writing satire in Tristram Shandy. We've had Jane Austen's delicate but devastating satire on social manners in Emma. But I suppose Waugh's object of attack was the age, an entire age.
Yeah, the 20th century, which he called the century of the common man. Ugh.
Yeah, well, he didn't mean that nicely, I'm afraid. And I suppose you might remember that the Roman satirist Juvenal looked around late imperial Rome and he concluded that these days it's difficult not to write satire. Well, Evelyn Waugh, who never did things by halves, went several steps further. According to him, the century he lived in was so degenerate that you actually couldn't satirise it.
Yeah. So he says this in an essay of 1946. Satire is a matter of period. It flourishes in a stable society and presupposes homogeneous moral standards, so the early Roman Empire, 18th century Europe. It is aimed at inconsistency and hypocrisy. It exposes polite cruelty and folly by exaggerating them. It seeks to produce shame. All this has no place in the century of the common man, where vice no longer pays lip service to virtue. The artist's only service to the disintegrated society of today is to create little independent systems of order of his own.
And that was how he saw things by 1946. But I wouldn't say it's necessarily a complete guide to the satirical novels of Evelyn Waugh. In some ways, actually, it isn't even a very good description of satire in general.
Yeah. Because part of what he says about satire just isn't true. We've tried to show that satire likes to create the illusion that it sits on a stable moral foundation, but often what it ends up showing is that the satirist is on that same shaky moral ground that everyone else sits on.
And it's also actually really risky to take anything that Waugh said entirely straight, because he liked to be deadly serious in a way that looked ridiculous, and to be ridiculous in ways that might then explode into something ultra serious. But I suppose we ought to dwell on his claim that satire is a matter of period, because his own writing did change a lot between 1928, when he published his first novel, Decline and Fall, and 1946, after he'd published Brideshead Revisited, which was his big success.
Yeah, and also after World War II, in which he had a fairly undistinguished career because of his sort of uncontrollable desire to piss off his superiors.
He was really good at that. Yeah.
He was really good at that. Yeah. He seems to have thought of it as a sort of crazy charade and let everyone know that he thought of it like that.
Yeah. And that was important because the Second World War, in theory, was a war fought in defence of an abstract notion of civilisation. But on the ground, as Waugh experienced it, it looked like a sort of massive series of cock-ups and mad schemes and bizarre events like exploding mobile toilets, which memorably happens in Waugh's war novels. And Waugh's war was almost as disillusioning and turbulent as the war experiences of Guy Crouchback, who is the hero. And also Waugh's alter ego. Very definitely, in the Sword of Honour trilogy, which he wrote from 1952 to 61, which tells basically the story of Waugh's war experiences.
And then after the war, he sort of dug himself into this persona of a violently offensive conservative Catholicism. He'd converted to Catholicism back in 1930, and then by the mid-40s, he is convinced that the Catholic Church is the only way to save Western civilization, though, probably it's too far gone to be saved.
Yeah, and he also believed that the war had unleashed a kind of madness, or I suppose actually accelerated the spread of a kind of madness that was already there, which was set to destroy what he thought of as traditional culture.
And no surprises, that meant terrible things for a wealthy novelist. Socialism, taxation.
Oh my God, what terrible things. Yeah, I mean, both of those things were very high on Waugh's lists of truly terrible things that happened in the century of the common man. Because he got extremely rich after the publication of Brideshead and became a serial tax evader, really, in order to fund his habit in art, cigars, wine, and the rest. But the culture that he thought was destroyed by the war, and which even in the 1930s he thought of as being more or less dead on its feet, meant lots of things. But at its core, I think, was a religious ideal, really, an ideal of a grand, true, universal church grounded in ritual and permanence and moral values and all those good things.
But the problem was that in his fiction, post-war, that ideal often manifests itself as snobbery, basically, doesn't it?
As it so often does, I
Yeah.
think, even today, yeah.
Yeah, indeed.
Yeah.
So culture comes to mean big stately homes occupied by ideally Catholic aristocrats who, live in this world of gentlemen's clubs, claret, burgundy, cigars, smart parties, like in Brideshead, which sort of looks back to this fake spray-painted golden age before the war.
Yeah, and in that world, the proles largely keep quiet. The common man, or serve one's drink or polish one's shoes. So Nanny sits in the attic of Brideshead, remembering Sebastian's happy childhood and reciting her rosary, and she doesn't really do anything else at all. She has no life apart from being a nanny. And almost all the servants in Evelyn Waugh's novels are like this.
Yeah, so that there is no disguising the massively reactionary conservatism which increasingly underpins his fiction and which he probably thought of as that stable moral ground that he, the right-minded satirist, needed to launch his attacks on the world.
And that's despite his claim that there was no such platform in the, let me give you the phrase again, Claire, because you like it so much, the century of the common man.
Happy to have it back. Yeah, I mean, we've seen this before. The kind of satire that represents its own times as crazy is often historically nostalgic, it's politically conservative. Think of Pope or Swift.
Yeah, absolutely. But I think Waugh's best writing, and again, this is like Pope and Swift really, is actually energised by the objects of his attack. So it gives you a sort of swirl of crazily disconnected and random things that usually happen to a hapless and usually nerveless hero.
Yeah, so like Guy Crouchback in The Sword of Honour, whom we mentioned, around whom the war sort of unfolds as this series of cock-ups brought about by mad officers.
Yeah, and the madness and modernity was something that Waugh was really good at representing. And I think he was good at representing it partly because he was almost mad himself.
Yeah. So in 1954, he had this awful breakdown precipitated by binging on sleeping pills and booze.
Which will do it to you, kids. Don't do it.
You heard it here first. Yeah. So he's on this boat trip to Ceylon, and he hears voices that he believes comes from inside the wiring of the ship.
And all those voices were screaming abuse and sort of murmuring conspiracies at him. And he fictionalised that fit of persecution mania in a novel called The Ordeal of Gilbert Pinfold. But I think it's pretty much a directly autobiographical transcription of what he experienced.
Yeah. So perhaps, like other satirists we've met, he needed the world to be mad, to respond to a madness that he felt living in it.
Yeah, and his descriptions of the madness around him tend to amplify it into a very distinctive blend of the hilariously anarchic, actually, which is remarkable for an authoritarian thinker, really, but also something that's often very deeply sinister.
Okay, anarchic and sinister. That takes us nicely to A Handful of Dust.
It does.
So let's look at it through the lens of what Waugh says about satire in 1946. He says, the artist's only service to the disintegrated society of today is to create little independent systems of order of his own. So can we use that to backtrack through his career up to the mid-1930s when he writes A Handful of Dust?
I think we could do that. And I think that Waugh's claim that the satirist creates those little independent systems of order of his own, it sounds curiously like Oscar Wilde, doesn't it? The artist is a creator of beautiful things that stand autonomously and are entirely outside the world.
Yeah, that is absolutely very wild, yeah.
And I think it helps to think of Waugh, particularly the pre-war, early war, it's terribly difficult to say, but you know what I mean, as a belated citizen of the 1890s. So 1930s war is basically living in the 1890s.
I feel like you're trying to provoke us, Colin, because the usual story about this period centres on World War I, doesn't it? This giant cosmic rupture of the war. So the war shook the foundations of British culture, it made the young lose faith in their elders, and then the 1920s, hooray, brings in lots of daring new artistic ideas and forms like jazz.
And all that jazz.
Which, make everyone feel very modern and very detached from the previous generation. So I don't know what you're banging on about the 1890s for.
Well, no, it's sort of true that the First World War made a difference, but I think it's at least partly false. Because as I was suggesting when I adopted temporarily the persona of Oscar Wilde at the end of the last podcast, there's really nothing very special about the 20th century. It was effectively invented by Oscar Wilde in the 1890s, and I will go to my grave
That's the hill you'll die on. Okay. Well, yeah, I mean, Wilde certainly was all about being modern, about being an agent of cultural change at all costs. I'll agree with you that far.
And there are other very important similarities between Waugh and Wilde, I think, Claire. I mean, let's take that absolutely crucial component in both their writing, which is English muffins.
Yep.
Tony Last, in A Handful of Dust, has a positively Wildean preoccupation with muffins when he entertains a lady called Jenny Abdul Akbar at his country house. "Ah, here comes tea at last," said Tony. "I hope you'll allow yourself to eat muffins. So many of our guests nowadays are on a diet. I think muffins one of the few things that make the English winter endurable." And Jenny, who's trying to get off with him, says, "Muffins stand for so much." And it's not clear she knows why she thinks this, but she is, of course, right.
Yep.
Muffins do embody a particular way of aristocratic life. You have a butler who brings them to you and a set of attitudes. And without all those things, the whole world would crumble. And I don't mean apple crumble, Claire.
This made me hungry. Well, no, I mean, I don't think you can viably build a history of 20th century British satire on muffins or crumble.
I think it is too soft a foundation for such a story.
Yeah.
But okay, all right, I'll be serious. I mean, Wilde and Waugh were both Oxford undergraduates, and they were both from middle class or professional backgrounds. And both of them wanted to go galloping off into decadence with the aristocracy, but basically they couldn't afford it, and the only way they could do it is by not paying their tailors, poor tailors. And they played really at being fantasy aristocrats when neither of them were. And I think that is really important because it gives their satire the sense of occupying a really fragile bubble of beauty and absurdity and an awareness that that bubble just at any moment could go pop. And so they're representations of these impeccable English country houses.
With their butlers and their muffins and their crumbles.
And that sort of stuff. I mean, those are projections of their social aspirations, right? Rather than anything like the world they were really part of. They were precarious self-inventors who learnt to perform and act.
Yeah, and primarily at Oxford. We blame here, as everywhere, Oxford.
Yeah, it is to blame for so much.
It is. So the Oxford that comes through in Waugh's writing, mostly in Decline and Fall, as we said, his first novel, and then later in Brideshead, is a place which has still got flavours of the sort of 1870s aestheticism of Wilde and Pater. Yeah,
although I suppose by the 1920s that aestheticism was deliberately taken to excess, but particularly by the extremely wealthy Etonians with whom Waugh mostly mingled, who were, they'd form clubs called things like the Hypocrites Club, yes. And they would dine and they would drink and then they would spew liberally and expect their butlers to clear it up, or their
butlers and nannies.
Yeah, yes. Absolutely. Yeah.
And Waugh was not an Etonian. His father was a publisher. Their household was literary, but not modernist or cool or edgy. He grew up in the middle-class suburbs of Hampstead and Golders Green. He got a scholarship to Oxford, which he needed because he couldn't afford it, but increasingly he's mingling with these flamboyant, wealthy undergraduates.
And when you say flamboyant, you mean sort of rich and openly gay?
I do mean that, cases. Yes.
Yeah. I mean, there were men who spent most of their time at Oxford pretending to be aesthetes, and they sort of wore cravats and big baggy trousers and had yellow buttonholes and, all that kind of thing.
And Waugh was the sort of student both of us have met. Clever, lazy, self-regarding, allergic to the library, meant to be reading history, didn't read much history, earned a bit of money, not enough to pay his tailors, by designing book plates for rich friends. And he wanted to be an artist after he came away from Oxford with a gentleman's third.
Yeah, and actually the fact that his father was a publisher makes that wish to be somebody who dealt with the visual arts rather than the verbal arts another sort of rebellion against his origins, actually. He's
Yeah.
wanting to go to the purer art form, I think.
So you can see he and his dad didn't really get on. And his Oxford career, I think, was a way to get out of the suburban middle-class world of his upbringing. His biographer, Martin Stannard, says that his infatuation with the aristocracy had begun as a reaction against his father's middle-class frugality. He had escaped from Golders Green to the ordered extravagance of adult nurseries, the Ritz and the great London and country houses.
And adult nurseries, there is a kind of
Exactly the
infantilism
word.
actually in that world, yeah. And that's why he tended to represent Oxford in his fiction through the eyes of a partially excluded outsider, rather than just straightforwardly as an idyll that he's fully part of. And it's a position that takes us back to one of the recurrent ideas, I suppose, of this series, that the satirist tends to be a sort of insider come outsider who's got a perspective on things that's not quite part of them.
Thanks for listening to this extract from On Satire, a close reading series from the London Review of Books. To listen to the full episode and all our other close reading series, sign up to our close reading subscription at lrb.me/close readings or click on the link in the description.